I didn't say a word when Margaret Thornfield stood up at the emergency board meeting, her face red with righteous fury, pointing her manicured finger at me like I was some kind of criminal. The entire room went silent as she declared that I was in flagrant violation of community standards and that my illegal occupation of property outside their jurisdiction was somehow still their business. I just reached into my briefcase, pulled out the original 1954 incorporation documents I'd spent 3 months hunting down in the county archives, and placed them quietly on the table in front of their lawyer. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might pass out. That's when I knew I had them. But let me back up, because this whole mess started 8 months earlier when I thought I was finally going to get some peace. I'd bought the old Henderson place after my divorce was finalized, needing somewhere quiet to put my life back together. It was a modest 2-bedroom house on 3 acres, tucked back in the woods about a quarter-mile from the main road. The property had been in the Henderson family for generations. And old Charlie Henderson had let it go for a fair price because he was moving to be closer to his grandkids. The house needed work. The porch sagged a bit. The paint was peeling, and the well pump needed replacing, but it had good bones, and more importantly, it had solitude. After 23 years of marriage, that ended with me discovering my ex-wife's affair with our financial advisor. I craved nothing more than the sound of wind through pine trees and the absence of other people's drama. The first few months were exactly what I needed. I spent my weekends fixing the porch, repainting the exterior a simple forest green, and clearing out the overgrown garden beds where Charlie's wife had once grown prize-winning tomatoes. I worked my accounting job during the week and came home to silence, which felt like medicine after years of walking on eggshells. I'd sit on my newly repaired porch in the evenings with a cup of coffee, listening to the owls and planning which section of fence to repair next. The nearest neighbor was probably half a mile away through the trees, and I barely saw another soul except for the mail carrier who drove up my long gravel driveway twice a week. I should have known it was too good to last. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, taped to my front door like some kind of legal notice. It was typed on official-looking letterhead for something called the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association and signed by one Margaret Thornfield, president. The letter informed me that I was in violation of community covenants for failing to maintain my lawn to acceptable standards and for conducting unauthorized construction activities without proper permits. It demanded that I contact their office within 10 days to discuss compliance or face escalating fines. I read that letter 3 times. Standing in my doorway, genuinely confused, I'd never heard of Pinewood Estates, and I certainly wasn't part of any homeowners association. My property deed made no mention of HOA covenants. I'd specifically asked my lawyer about that during the purchase, because I'd wanted to avoid exactly this kind of nonsense. The unauthorized construction they mentioned was apparently my porch repair work I'd done on my own house. On my own property, with materials I'd bought with my own money, I figured it was some kind of mistake. Maybe they had the wrong address. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I called the number on the letterhead Margaret Thornfield answered on the second ring, and I could tell immediately that she was the type of person who considered herself very important. Her voice had that crisp, authoritative tone of someone used to being obeyed, without question. I explained politely that I'd received their letter, but believed there had been an error. As my property wasn't part of any HOA, the silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. "Mr. Patterson," she finally said, and I could practically hear her pursing her lips. "The Henderson property falls within our community boundaries. Just because the previous owner chose to ignore his obligations doesn't mean you can do the same." I tried to explain that my deed showed no HOA restrictions, but she cut me off. "We'll be sending someone to conduct a property inspection next week. Please ensure your violations are corrected by then." The line went dead. That evening, I pulled out all my closing documents and read through them again carefully. There was no mention of any homeowners association, no recorded covenants, no architectural review requirements. My property was zoned rural residential, and according to the county records, I was well outside any established subdivision boundaries. I even called my lawyer, confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't subject to any HOA authority. The inspection never happened. But 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one informed me that I now owed $350 in fines for continued non-compliance and warned that failure to pay would result in a lien against my property. Attached was a fuzzy photograph of my house, apparently taken from the road with a telephoto lens, with arrows pointing to what they considered violations: my green paint job not on the approved color list, my gravel driveway should be concrete or asphalt, and my vegetable garden unauthorized landscaping modifications. I'd had enough. I spent that weekend drafting a careful letter explaining that my property was not part of their HOA, was not subject to their covenants, and that their continued harassment constituted trespassing and possibly extortion. One included copies of my deed, the property survey, and a statement from my lawyer. I sent it certified mail and figured that would be the end of it. Margaret Thornfield called me at work 3 days later. She was no longer trying to sound professional. "Listen here, Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "I don't know who you think you are, but you can't just move into our community and ignore our rules. We've worked too hard to maintain our property values to let some outsider drag down the neighborhood." "I'm not in your neighborhood," I said calmly. "I'm not part of your HOA, and I'm not subject to your rules." "We'll see about that," she snapped. I hung up. That's when things started getting weird. I'd come home from work to find my mailbox had been moved, not damaged, just relocated about 10 feet down my driveway. My garbage cans, which I left at the end of my drive on pickup day, started disappearing. I'd put them out Tuesday night, and they'd be gone by Wednesday morning, only to reappear days later, dumped in the ditch a quarter-mile away. Someone was walking my property line at night, because I'd see footprints in the soft dirt after it rained. And twice, I found survey stakes that had been pulled up and thrown into the woods. The breaking point came in January. I was at work when my neighbor Tom called, not my closest neighbor, but a guy who lived about a mile away and occasionally borrowed my chainsaw. He was calling to let me know that there were people at my house with a truck and trailer, and it looked like they were removing something from my property. I left work immediately and drove home to find Margaret Thornfield standing in my driveway with 2 other people, watching as a crew loaded my custom-built mailbox onto a trailer. The mailbox my grandfather had made for me 40 years ago, the one thing I'd specifically asked for when we cleaned out his workshop after he died. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I asked, and I'll admit, my voice wasn't as calm as usual. Margaret smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Removing unpermitted structures," she said, holding up an official-looking document. "This mailbox violates our community standards for uniformity and aesthetic compliance." I looked at the paper she was waving around. It appeared to be some kind of removal order, but the letterhead was different from her previous correspondence. The language was vague and official-sounding, without actually saying much of anything. More importantly, the property description was wrong. They'd listed an address that didn't exist, and a lot number that corresponded to nothing on any county map. "I'd seen you're stealing my property," I said flatly. "We're enforcing community standards," she replied. "You can pick up your mailbox at our management office once you've paid your outstanding fines and compliance fees." That night, I filed a police report for theft. But the responding officer seemed reluctant to get involved in what he called a civil HOA matter. The desk sergeant suggested I contact a lawyer, which I'd already planned to do. But first I was going to do something I should have done months ago. I was going to find out exactly what gave Margaret Thornfield the idea that she had any authority over my property. I took a personal day from work and drove to the county courthouse. I spent the entire day in the records office, pulling every document I could find related to Pinewood Estates, the Henderson property, and anything else that might explain how this HOA thought they had jurisdiction over land that clearly wasn't part of their development. What I found was interesting, but not in the way I'd expected. Pinewood Estates had been incorporated as an HOA in 1987, covering a 47-lot subdivision about 2 miles from my property. The original covenants were properly recorded, and the development appeared to be legitimate. But as I dug deeper, I found something strange. The legal description in their incorporation documents included Language about future expansion. Areas and contiguous properties subject to annexation upon development. It was vague enough to be meaningless, but official sounding enough that someone might think it gave them broader authority than it actually did. More importantly, I found the original plat map for the Pinewood Estates development. The boundaries were clearly marked, and my property wasn't even close to being included. We were separated by a substantial buffer of undeveloped land, a creek, and what appeared to be a right-of-way for power lines. There was no conceivable interpretation under which my property could be considered part of their community. But the most interesting thing I found was in the annual filing. Requirements for the HOA. In 1954, the state had passed a law requiring all homeowners associations to file yearly reports confirming their active status, listing their current officers, and paying a nominal fee to maintain their legal standing. It was a simple requirement. Most HOAs handled it routinely. Pinewood. States hadn't filed the required paperwork in 8 years, according to state law. Any HOA that failed to file required documents and pay fees for more than 5 consecutive years was automatically dissolved. Their corporate charter was revoked, their legal authority was terminated, and their ability to enforce covenants or collect fees was eliminated. They could still exist as an informal neighborhood group, but they had no more legal power than a book club. Margaret. Thornfield had been running around threatening people and stealing property. On behalf of an organization that didn't legally exist, I spent the next week researching state statutes and case law, making copies of every relevant document, and preparing what I thought would be a simple matter of informing the HOA that they'd lost their legal standing. I even felt a little sorry for them. It was an honest mistake, the kind of bureaucratic oversight that could happen to anyone. But when I called Margaret Thornfield to explain the situation, she didn't respond the way I'd expected. "That's ridiculous," she said, after I'd carefully outlined what I'd discovered. "We're a properly incorporated HOA with full authority over our community standards." "I'm looking at the state records right now," I said patiently. "Your corporate charter was revoked in 2016 for failure to file required documents. You haven't existed as a legal entity for 8 years. "I don't care what some computer printout says," she snapped. "We have covenants, we have authority, and we have the right to protect our property values. You're going to comply with our requirements or face the consequences." That's when I realized this. It wasn't about bureaucratic confusion or honest mistakes. Margaret Thornfield knew exactly what she was doing, and she didn't care whether she had legal authority or not. She'd been running her little fiefdom for so long that she'd started believing her own press releases. The fake removal order for my mailbox suddenly made more sense. She'd been making up official sounding documents and hoping nobody would call her bluff. I hung up and called my lawyer. The next 3 months were expensive, but educational. My attorney filed complaints with the State Attorney General's office for fraudulent business practices, with the county for filing false documents, and with the local district attorney for theft and extortion. We also filed a civil lawsuit against Margaret Thornfield personally, and against the 3 other people who served as officers of the defunct HOA. The response was immediate and predictable. Rather than acknowledging they'd made a mistake, the HOA doubled down. They filed a countersuit claiming I was a nuisance property owner who was damaging community values. They sent certified letters to my employer, claiming I was engaged in illegal activities. They even went so far as to file a false complaint with the county health department claiming I was operating an illegal septic system. Each escalation just gave me more documentation for my case. But it was also making my life miserable. I was spending more time dealing with their harassment than I was spending on my actual job. My neighbors started avoiding me, not because they believed the HOA's claims, but because association with me seemed to bring unwanted attention. I'd moved out to the country for peace and quiet, and instead I was living in the middle of a legal war zone. That's when I decided to stop playing defense and go on the offensive. I hired a private investigator to look into the HOA's activities. Over the past several years, what we found was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond my situation. Margaret Thornfield had been using the HOA's presumed authority to harass and extort money from property owners throughout the area, whether they were actually part of the development or not. She'd collected thousands of dollars in fines and fees from people who paid up rather than fight. She'd placed liens on properties, filed false complaints with government agencies, and even had people's utilities disconnected by claiming to be their HOA representative. Most of her victims were elderly or newcomers to the area who didn't know their rights. They'd received official-looking letters demanding payment and compliance, and they'd assumed the letters were legitimate. Some had paid hundreds or even thousands of dollars to make the harassment stop. Others had been forced to make expensive modifications to their properties to comply with fictional requirements. The private investigator also uncovered something else interesting. Margaret Thornfield owned a property management company that had been hired by several legitimate HOAs in the area. When people paid fines or compliance fees to the defunct Pinewood Estates HOA, that money had been flowing into accounts controlled by her management company. She'd been using the HOA as a front for what was essentially a protection racket. Armed with this information, my lawyer reached out to the FBI's white-collar crime division. Financial fraud, mail fraud, extortion, and operating a criminal enterprise are federal offenses. And Margaret Thornfield had been documenting her crimes in writing for years. The federal investigation took 6 months, during which time I had to endure continued harassment from the HOA, but I knew something they didn't. Federal agents had been monitoring their communications and financial transactions since March. Every threatening letter they sent, every false document they filed, every penny they collected in illegal fees was being added to their federal charges. The end came faster than I'd expected. I was at home on a Thursday evening in September when my phone rang. It was my lawyer, and he sounded almost giddy. "They want to meet," he said. "Emergency board meeting tomorrow night. Margaret Thornfield specifically requested that you attend." "What's this about?" I asked. "I think they've finally realized they're in serious trouble," he said. "The federal agents executed search warrants on their homes and offices this morning. Word travels fast in a small community. The meeting was held at the Pinewood Estates Community Center. It's a modest building that served as the clubhouse for the actual residents of the development. When I arrived, I found about 30 people crammed into a room designed for half that many. Most were residents I'd never seen before, but I recognized Margaret Thornfield immediately. She was sitting at a folding table at the front of the room, flanked by the other HOA officers and their lawyer. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past month. The lawyer did most of the talking, and his message was simple. They were prepared to offer me a settlement. They would acknowledge that my property was not part of their HOA, drop all fines and demands, return my mailbox, and pay my legal fees. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue further legal action. I listened politely, then stood up and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, "I appreciate the settlement offer, but I think there's something you need to understand about your homeowners association." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the stack of documents I'd been carrying for months. According to the state of North Carolina, the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association ceased to exist as a legal entity in 2016. Your corporate charter was revoked for failure to file required documents and pay fees. For the past 8 years, you've been operating under the authority of an organization that doesn't exist. The room went completely silent. I could see people looking at each other, confused and concerned. Furthermore, I continued, "The person who's been acting as your president has been using your defunct HOA as a front for what appears to be an extortion operation. She's been collecting fines and fees from property owners throughout this area, whether they're part of your development or not, and depositing that money into accounts controlled by her private business." Margaret Thornfield started to stand up, probably to object, but her lawyer grabbed her arm and pulled her back down. "The FBI raided her home and office yesterday morning," I said. "They seized financial records, correspondence, and evidence of what they're calling a multi-year fraud scheme. Ms. Thornfield is likely going to be facing federal charges for mail fraud, wire fraud, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise." The murmur that went through the room was like wind through dry leaves. I could see the actual residents of Pinewood Estates realizing that they'd been unwitting participants in a criminal scheme. Now, I said, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to sit down. You're going to have a discussion about whether you want to continue operating as an informal neighborhood group, or whether you want to reincorporate as a legitimate HOA with proper legal standing. If you choose the latter, I'd suggest you start by electing new officers and hiring a new management company. I sat down and watched as 30 people turned to stare at Margaret Thornfield. The room erupted in angry voices and shouted questions. People wanted to know how much money she'd collected, where it had gone, and whether they were going to be held responsible for her actions. Her lawyer was frantically trying to quiet everyone down, but it was too late. The mob had turned. Margaret Thornfield finally stood up, her face red with rage and humiliation. "This is all his fault," she said, pointing at me. "He's an outsider who came here to cause trouble. We were protecting our community values. You were stealing money?" Someone shouted from the back of the room. "You put liens on properties that weren't even in our development," another voice added. "How much did you take?" This from an elderly woman in the front row. The lawyer was packing up his papers, clearly realizing that his client was about to make things worse for herself. Margaret Thornfield looked around the room at faces that had once shown her respect and deference, and now showed nothing but anger and betrayal. "You're all going to regret this," she said finally, then stormed out of the room. The meeting continued for another hour. With residents trying to figure out what to do next, they elected temporary officers, agreed to pursue reincorporation through proper legal channels, and unanimously voted to terminate their relationship with Margaret Thornfield's management company. Several people came up to me afterward, too, apologized for the harassment I'd endured, and to thank me for exposing what had been going on. Margaret Thornfield was indicted by a federal grand jury. 3 months later, on 14 counts, including mail fraud, wire fraud, and racketeering. The investigation had uncovered evidence that she'd defrauded property owners throughout 3 counties, collecting over $180,000 in illegal fines and fees over a period of 6 years. She eventually pled guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, plus restitution to her victims. The actual residents of Pinewood Estates did reincorporate their HOA, but under proper legal guidance and with strict oversight of their finances. They sent me a formal letter of apology and a fruit basket, which I thought was a nice gesture. More importantly, they focused their attention on their own development and left me alone. As for me, I finally got the peace and quiet I'd been looking for. I finished restoring my house, got my grandfather's mailbox back, and spent my weekends working in the garden that nobody could tell me how to plant. The federal restitution payment more than covered my legal fees, and I used the leftover money to build a proper workshop behind the house. Sometimes, I see cars slow down as they pass the end of my driveway, and I wonder if people are still talking about the HOA scandal. But mostly, I just enjoy the silence. I sit on my porch in the evenings with my coffee, listening to the owls, and thinking about how sometimes the best revenge is just letting people dig their own graves deep enough to fall into. Margaret Thornfield had spent 8 years building a house of cards based on assumed authority and intimidation. All it took was one person willing to read the fine print to bring the whole thing crashing down. And the beautiful thing about legal revenge is that it's not really revenge at all. It's just justice, served at exactly the right temperature.